Alright, so something happened, and that's the Duna probe. It actually just encountered Duna, so I figured we'd check this thing out, and I just wanted to see what it might take to, for this thing to encounter or circularize around Duna. It's going to take 2000 delta V, but I'm not really too concerned about that because this orbit is really wacky. It's not a very precision encounter. So I'm sure with a more precision encounter, this would be much less delta V requirement. I don't even think this thing has 2k left. But we did get that contract to fly by Duna completed, so that's neat. How about we just wait until this maneuver node, and I'm kind of curious as to how much fuel this thing does have. Did we bring any science instruments? Maybe? Nope, looks like just a battery and a probe. Alright. So we will wait for this maneuver node. There we go, close enough. And there you can see it. We got Ike, we got Duna, and it's becoming time to actually go here. Well, let's see, how much delta V does this probe have? I'm gonna say definitely not 2000. Although it's possible. Now, it's gonna be about maybe 1500 that this thing had. Or it might actually have 2000 because as we use fuel, it gains a higher thrust to weight ratio, which means it uses less fuel for the same amount of delta V change. Well, that's neat. So apparently now we have a small probe around Duna. So we completed a parameter, what? Achieve orbit around Duna. Cool. Now this probe really can't do anything else, but it can at least sit here and be the pioneer of Duna. This small probe, it'll just kind of give us all the information on how red the planet is and how its polar ice caps are white. Or kind of pale red. I guess they're not completely white, there's a little bit of a red tint. Either that or it's the optical illusion of the fact the planet is so red. Anyway, it's pretty much useless to us now, so let's head back to trying to refuel stuff. Alright guys, hello and welcome to episode 18 of my mostly stock career. Now the little about 2.5 minute snippet you just watched I'm trying to keep this in chronological order, and that's something that I recorded, and this kind of is occurring after it. Now what we have here and what we're looking at is a vessel that I designed to land on Minmus and dock with our small drilling station. Now, to be honest, with how long it took to drill, I am about 100% certain it would have been faster to create a larger drilling rig and land it, because the amount of resources we were getting was very insignificant, so it probably took somewhere around 120 game days or Kerbal days to actually fill one of these things up, and I've filled it up twice. This is actually the second filling of it, and one thing to note is it lands on its 4 legs, the normal landing legs you see on the back of it. That's how it lands, and then it rolls over onto the wheels, and then it's able to cart itself around to dock. But the thing is, when it has all of its fuel in it, it's too heavy to continue rolling. Now, I'm certain I could probably retract the back landing legs so that it kind of falls back on its normal landing legs, or the back landing gear, so it falls on the legs. But I found another method to be quite effective in this thing's ability to take off, and that is taking it off more like a plane. Now, we're going to be docking with the heavy hauler, and this was the original idea was I was going to send this thing down, it was going to get a couple loads of fuel, go to the heavy fuel hauler and fill that thing up with fuel, and then that was going to go bring the fuel to our Duna mission so that we could refuel the whole thing. That plan is going to change up a little bit, but I still think this is a pretty significant bit, so we're here. So once we've waited for our target to be pretty much in position, we're going to start just firing the engines, and we're going to take off from Minmus. Now, Minmus is actually probably one of the very few planets you can do this with unless you get a good mountain range on the moon. But Minmus, since it's got perfectly flat, basically empty lakes or salt beds or whatever you really want to call them, the flats, since they're perfectly flat, you can just roll across them with wheels without an issue of actually being knocked around or flipped upside down. And because of that, you can just gain speed, and then once you've gained enough speed, you can just rotate up like I am, and eventually you will just slowly peel away from the planet. So as you can see, we're just peeling away from the planet, and now we're flying our rocket super low. Of course, this will eventually take us up into orbit. But min-miss, you can do this. You can do it both ways. You can do it with takeoffs and landings. Landings, you have to be very careful with it because you will have almost no friction. Since there's no gravity, there's no friction, which means brakes don't really do anything for you because there's no friction. So landing is a little bit more difficult. You need RCS or retrograde thrusters to slow yourself down. But for this, we're just taking off and we're going to dock to our next station. Now, the reason I've done a bit of stuff without recording is because I want to get along with the Duna mission. I'm just kind of getting tired of repeatedly going to, oh, this is going to min-miss, we're going to min-miss again, we're going to min-miss again. Because we've shown it so many times, I don't think it's 100% necessary at this point. I kind of want to get along with the Duna mission. And hopefully we will be at Duna by episode 20 of this series. That was kind of my goal. But then we took a little more time with science because I never anticipated we'd go to different biomes on the moon initially. So it took a couple more episodes than I anticipated. Anyway, I launched these two things, the heavy fuel hauler and this min-miss lander kind of fuel thing. Launched both of them using a lot of the 3.75 meter parts because they're quite heavy. I did launch them both completely empty. Well, I launched this one completely empty so that way it didn't weigh as much. It was only probably 40 to 50 tons. And when it's empty, it's a lot heavier when it's full, over 150. And the heavy fuel hauler actually used its own engine, which we'll be seeing it here in a minute. But it used its own engine to actually launch itself, so it was full of fuel, but it had a 1.0 thrust-to-weight ratio and had a few SRBs to help it out. So as you can see, we're just taking this thing and we're doing a from ground to encounter kind of maneuver, because they're not that difficult to do. You just kind of give it a rough time. We're just staying below the orbit so that we catch up to it because we launched after it. And there we go, we have our encounter. Now, of course, we're just going to use our knowledge of maneuver nodes and the nav ball to push our retrograde vector and pull our prograde vector closer and closer to the target so that we encounter it at hardly any distance. Which, of course, makes it so that our encounter is super close and we can just go straight to docking without any need of doing this match velocities, burn towards it, match velocities, burn towards it, and repeat that step. We can do it all in one go as long as we have an encounter that's about 10 kilometers or less in distance initially, then this is a pretty effective tactic. So, out in the distance you can see our heavy fuel hauler, and we're going to be docking to it with the claw. Now, a design flaw of the heavy fuel hauler, and I'm going to call it a design flaw, is the fact that it doesn't have any means to dock to any other craft. So it's really just meant for moving fuel around. It's not good at it's just not good at anything else since it can't dock. And because it can't dock, I think I should have built it a little more massive, because it does use a decent bit of fuel to travel around. So although it can cart around 20,000 units of fuel, it uses a lot to actually move that much. And I'm thinking if I had put 4 tanks or even 6 tanks of the orange sets around this thing, it would have been much more efficient because it would have been carting around 50 to 60,000 units of fuel, and it'd use not too much more to cart that much more around. It'd probably use 2,000 instead of 1,000 units of fuel to get back to Kerbal, or it just used significantly less compared to how much fuel it's hauling. Now, it does take a little bit of time to move all this fuel to the other craft, since we're not using any mods like TAC Fuel Balancer or the Goodspeed Fuel Transfer, or Goodspeed Fuel Pump Transfer. I'm not sure the exact name. I know it's Goodspeed Fuel Pump. You'll probably find it if you searched that. But basically we're moving it all stock. We can't just transfer it out. And we're going to be leaving about just a couple hundred in the actual docking piece. And the reason it only needs a couple hundred is, well, it's on Minmus and it just needs enough to land again, which leaving it about 600 units of fuel gives it about 1,000 delta V. So it's pretty efficient with its engines. Now we've transferred all the fuel. This thing is on its way to being full. It's just under 100% full. And what we wanted originally to do was, once it was full like it is now, we were going to send it down to Kerbal, but we quickly changed our idea on that because it's going to cost it around 5,000 of its 20,000 units of fuel just to move it. So I didn't really see that as being too much of worth it. So what I decided instead was, why not try and move this thing? It also gave it a really good chance to test this Duna mission's stability, because since there is that huge line of docking nodes where we have the Ike lander and the Duna refinery, I'm anticipating quite drastically that there's going to be wobble if we start accelerating too much. So that's kind of what I want to test. I want to test the thing's wobble. And as it turns out, it does have one. So we're bringing it to Minmus. And we're going to bring it to Minmus and we're going to actually dock it, or not dock it, but encounter it with that heavy fuel hauler, and we'll move the fuel over. So it was kind of counterproductive to transfer all the fuel into the large fuel hauler, since we're just going to be transferring it back and then over to this thing. So we won't really show too much of that, because the plans did change once I figured out how much fuel that the heavy fuel hauler was going to be using. It's not as efficient as I had expected it to be, since my original idea was that I would be able to take the thing and bring it to Kerbal and then kind of aero brake probably 400 to 500 units, 400 to 500 delta V, instead of having to burn the entire couple thousand, or about 1,000 to move it. So because I can aero brake, since they changed the way heating works in this version of KSP, it was originally designed in version 1.02 to work, but then it didn't work because they changed heating quite dramatically, and even at 60 kilometers, that thing starts getting destroyed by the atmosphere. So it can't aero brake any more than 100 or 200 meters per second, which isn't really worth it. So we brought the thing over to Minmus. It was just this typical docking procedure, and now we have a smaller rocket that I just brought over with Valentina in it. And Valentina is, I know we're skipping around a lot, but Valentina is going on the Duna mission, and we're just transferring her in, as well as trying to get Bill some more experience. So we're going to find Bill here, and now we're going to do something interesting. We are going to just kind of try and encounter Bill. Now, since our ship can only hold one Kerbal, if we brought Valentina to this rocket, she would be stuck over here. And since this rocket is out of fuel, we don't want to have to go through the process of refueling it and moving this rocket, or anything complex. So I decided the easiest way to do this is going to just be to take Bill himself as a Kerbonaut and do a little bit of an encounter. Now, because Bill doesn't actually have view of maneuver nodes, I have to spend a little time playing with them, as well as I need to know pretty good on how the orbit works in order to try and rendezvous without any extra knowledge. I was really hoping Kerbal Engineer would give me some extra information that I needed, but it really didn't. So I burn what I assume is prograde, and that's what I get up on my encounter. Now, what it does tell me, Kerbal Engineer, is my velocity relative to my target. Or it tells me how much delta V is left on my node, I should say. So I made a maneuver node, and then I just burned in all directions until my maneuver node's delta V was very low. So I was able to actually burn the maneuver. But now we're just going to kind of play this by ear. So knowing how orbits work, the way I'm currently on my orbit, what I need to do is burn away from Minmus, because that will force my apoapsis in front of me, and it'll also force that behind me, instead of being so high, it'll force that down. So it will kind of re-angle my orbit, which is what I'm attempting to do as I get closer. So if you can see, every once in a while when I get back into the map view, you'll notice my orbit is a little more straightened. And that's because I'm just burning away from the planet and a little bit prograde and retrograde, trying to encounter my target. So I'm just playing this by knowing which direction I burn and how it affects my orbit. I don't need maneuver nodes for this, although they probably would have been very helpful. So again, we're just going to wait until we're closer, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to burn towards my target in an attempt to get closer to it. And as you can see, I'm keep looking at my map to just check which direction I'm affecting my orbit. So you can see each time I go back very quickly, I'm kind of flashing through it because this is sped up, you can see that it's becoming more and more aligned, just playing it by eye. So then once I get my orbit pretty well aligned, I just start burning towards my target. And that actually gets me my encounter. So you can see we have an encounter, it's really close. So now that I have a really close encounter, I'm just going to wait it out until I get there and just burn straight towards my target. And what that will do is it won't align my orbit, but it will make it so that I'm closer. So you can see, Bill is drifting towards our target. We actually had the wrong one selected, but they were both close enough to each other it didn't matter. And we got to our ship. Just kind of playing the maneuver nodes, knowing how orbits work. So actually learning how the maneuver nodes affect Kerbal Space Program and how burning in certain directions will affect your orbit just visually without the need of a maneuver node, just playing with it, can be that helpful. It can let you take a Kerbonaut and actually encounter them without the need of many maneuver nodes or the need of any excess information. You can just play it all just by looking at the orbit and how the direction you burn affects it. Knowing, of course, which direction to burn would affect it, the basics on how an orbit would affect it. Very useful skill to have if you want to play Kerbal Space Program on, like, say, a harder difficulty, since using Kerbonauts to move around Minmus would be very efficient, since I only used about 1.5 of Bill's EVA propellant to do that encounter, and it was quite a huge transfer. Now, what we're doing here is a little bit interesting. I'm trying to get Bill as much experience as I can, because we want him to hit level 3. Now, he's not going to go on the Duna mission. He's actually going to go on the rover, and he's going to be the rover's pilot. But I still need to get him to level 3, and I think I'm going to have to land him on a couple planets to do that, or at least land him on the moon, maybe do a flyby of Minmus afterwards. Because he doesn't quite get to level 3, but he does get to level 2 and almost there. So what I did there was I just barely left Kerbin, and then the second I left it, I burned straight towards Kerbin, and that of course forced me back into Kerbin's sphere of influence. And then I slowed down and luckily got an encounter with the moon, which I was pretty happy with. So now that we're flying by Kerbin again, we do a maneuver node to slow ourselves, to encounter the moon, to get fly by the moon experience for Bill, because like I said, we want to level him up, so we're doing lots of stuff to do that. And of course, we burn into the encounter, wait it out until we go to the moon, do our really quick flyby, and I'm just checking my fuel to make sure we have enough. We have more than enough fuel for this. Once we get to our apoapsis, we just burn retrograde until we are back into Kerbin's sphere of influence. Now, had I known I had a lot more Delta V than I thought in this vessel, a lot more fuel, which I could have checked my Delta V. I keep forgetting I have Flight Engineer. Since I've been playing most of this career without it, I keep just kind of ignoring the fact that when it's available to me, I should be using it. So I didn't check how much fuel I had. If I had more, I probably could have done an orbit around the moon. Or I know I could have done an orbit around the moon based on how much fuel I had, which means I probably, or maybe, might have been able to level Bill up, because an orbit around the moon would have given him more experience. And of course, we fall back down into Kerbin's desert with our lander, and Bill returns to Kerbin. He gets to level 2. He's about 80% of the way to level 3, so it's going to be pretty easy to level him up, but we'll be doing that next time. This is a bit of a weird episode since it's been quite a long skip. Hopefully we will be able to abstain from doing those long skips, especially when it gets really hectic and confusing about plans changing for the career. Anyhow, I thank you all for watching. This is PTT GRW, signing out.